Hello and welcome to our presentation on Global Heartlands Detroit, the first third world city in the U.S. Our group members are Noelle Ozuski.
Hi, I'm Elise Quincy.
I'm Jordan.
Hello, my name is Morgan O'Keefe.
Carolyn Pranav and myself.
Over the course of this presentation, me and my co-presenters will cover the methods, findings, and core themes of one Faranak Maraftab's ethnographical work in the town of Beardstown, Iowa, documented in her book Global Heartlands. Specifically, we will be covering her study of the subset of the migrant population in Beardstown that consists of African American migrants, specifically hailing from Detroit. We will be breaking down her study as well as the data she obtained throughout it, detailing key findings about how and why this labor migration occurred, drawing connections to the wider sociological community through theories and analysis, and finally concluding with a look into what potential future research could look like and how it could build off of the findings of Maraftab. There is a table of contents below to help you find any slides you are specifically looking for. And with that, I'll pass it off to my first co-presenter.
And I had the connections to the course, and I found in the article written by Hassi and Storti that in the article of Globalization and Culture, the 3H scenarios, discusses the impact of globalization and culture, identity, and diversity. Heterogenization is the third scenario within the article, which describes as a process where cultures become more diverse and fragmented. This is seen in Detroit in the 1960s when job markets were becoming smaller and white people were hired more than black people, which led to a surplus of population. This also explains that the two different diverse cultures could not form together and flow in harmony. And then during lecture 10, we also talked about how immigration and migrants are at a higher risk of human rights violations, in part due to racial profiling. Within the book, Carlos' son was jumped due to other black men profiling him as a threat to their representation. Due to the racist attitudes, however, Carlos and Aaron tried to live in Springfield first. After working and living in Beardstown, they continued to experience racist harassment. Lastly, I found in the documentary Living on a Dollar, it was a film that follows a young four friends that are living on a dollar for 2 months in rural Guatemala. The film highlights the challenges of extreme poverty, including hunger, illness, financial insecurity. And then within Chapter 5, The Global Heartland, this can be also represented on a smaller scale and similarities of some struggles. From 1960 to the 2000s, more than a quarter of Detroit's population was living in poverty. The poverty led to many individuals to sell drugs in order to cope or find temporary solutions to their issues.
Chapter 5 of Maraftab's book seeks to specifically provide a new perspective on American urban decline, and this is by talking about Detroit's issues with marginalization and minority inequality, and really bringing up the concept of third world cities and challenging the notion of it. Usually core countries are very stable, and periphery countries are the ones dealing with issues such as these. Here we see a reverse picture. Implementing the perspective can contribute to urban studies and globalization discourse, where communities can gather together and really talk about the deep-rooted issues within society, where hopefully a policy can be talked about and maybe set in place, leading me to talk about why these policies should be informed and put into place. These challenges in response in Detroit, it offers valuable lessons for policymakers, urban planners, and the community activists that really want to make a difference in within their city, and really take the practices set into place and maybe spread them around other deindustrialized cities. And this connects to our class and the fact that usually core cities are the ones that are very well put together, don't deal with minority issues or marginalization issues or income inequality issues, whereas periphery nations are usually the ones that deal with it. But this shows that even periphery nations even core nations can have deep-rooted societal issues as well.
Theory and literature review. The author contextualizes her work in a broader field of relational methodologies, which include studying globalization through ethnology. Studying globalization through ethnology and builds on the work of Brewer 2001. It was that study. The author rejects the premise that the local exists only as an object of the study that is acted upon by the global and embraces a context which the two are dynamic and are not necessarily replicated in varying instances. Studying the local and global as a dynamic and interactive forces builds on the work of Hart 2006, Messi 2004, Broadway and colleagues 2001. Next, the author also cites that Annie T. Singh 2005 and James Ferguson 2006 are relevant in the work of understanding the friction and inequality in globalization. A quote is, "In fact, I practice multi-sided global and ethnograph through an interscar analysis that moves across and between micro worlds of specific practices and places and macro worlds of political, economics, processes, and policies." From the author on page 15.
I had the data and methods slide. The author spends a lot of this chapter talking to people who had moved from Detroit to a small town called Beardstown and talking about their lives, and so that's where she gets a lot of her data from this chapter. But she does do a little bit of text and data analysis of other studies or articles that she has found that are relevant to her own that she has cited in her own book. So those are the two places that she's gotten data for this chapter.
So some of the key background points regarding our chapter. Beardstown, Illinois was once considered a white American rural town. Beardstown definitely diversified over decades, beginning especially in 1987 when their trademark company of the community, Oscar Mayer, was bought out by Cargill after it failed. Cargill is a meat packing company known for its difficult labor, and in which the authors describe as dangerous, dirty, and difficult, the 3 Ds. The author also described how the company recruited groups of various ethnic and cultural backgrounds, beginning especially in the 90s with Mexicans coming all the way down from Mexico up to seek jobs, East Africans, and primarily what we focus on was African Americans from Detroit. Specifically, the African American community had long been targeted in Beardstown, Illinois, known as a sundown town with enforced segregation and various forms of racism. This chapter specifically focuses on Detroit's push factors, in away from Detroit and into Beardstown, Illinois, which had many pull factors for these migrants. So for some of the key findings that we discovered while reading Chapter 5, the first one, although they, which is African Americans, have not crossed any international borders, they have crossed many deep social and cultural borders to take jobs at Cargill. Essentially, this is to describe the historic roots of Beardstown's racist past. Like the author points out in the chapter and previous chapters, the Ku Klux Klan was especially prevalent in Beardstown, and it enforced racial segregation, sundowning, and prime examples of white opposition to migrants like African Americans or even the Mexican immigrants as well. They were fiercely against African American presence, especially at Cargill, because there was a stigma of taking their jobs. Like other international labor migrants, African Americans migrated from Detroit, and ran the risk of encountering deeply embedded white supremacy in rural Illinois. They were just like any other type of migrant. They were subject to racism and hatred. So our second key finding was neoliberalism can be defined by the reduction of social services and welfare programs, replacement of welfare with workfare, the use of interest rates by independent central banks to keep inflation in check, even at the risk of increasing unemployment. As Erin pointed out, which is an African American that the author interviewed to include in her story, the late 1960s to 1970s marked a noticeable shift in industrial production. From the 30s to the 60s, Detroit was a once flourishing mass production metropolis that employed a vast percentage of African Americans living there. As corporations began to shift to transnational labor that could implement lower worker wages and cost of production and were ultimately less safe, factories began to leave Detroit and move elsewhere. Additionally, neoliberal policies in national government began to take effect during this time with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher when they were just starting to gain traction. The simultaneous reduction of these African American jobs, coupled with neoliberal welfare cuts, exacerbated the rate at which Detroit African Americans were impoverished. Inflation was definitely rising. African Americans struggled to find livable wages as well. By the turn of the century, nearly a quarter of Detroit's less than 1 million people were living in poverty, and the unemployment was at nearly 23%. Detroit was the first third world city in the United States, and the privatization of federal organizations, banks, and social services had negative impacts on these citizens, ultimately reaching places like Detroit, with its most vulnerable population being African Americans. Our next finding was the persistent discrimination in hiring, combined with spatial segregation and a shift to deindustrialization of the city, made the prospect of employment for blacks in metropolitan Detroit increasingly dim. Segregation and tactics like redlining were used in places like Detroit. Many African Americans faced housing discrimination, hiring discrimination, and in social groups and activities. Detroit was considered to be a low-income, dangerous place, and African Americans were stuck there. As another interviewee that the author shared, named Carol, pointed out in her story, she used to need to carry a gun to protect herself and her sons from the dangerous settings in Detroit. People were very rowdy, as she described. These were eventual push factors out of Detroit, which we have kind of highlighted so far. And then finally, our fourth finding was that Cargill recruiters said that full-time jobs were available and that the company would pay for bus tickets as well as providing $1,000 to help new workers get started, with the advance payments to be deducted from paychecks later on. They also told us how they were a good family business and they would relocate us to have a nice laid-back life. This quote from Erin highlights some of the pull factors that Cargill had to offer to migrant workers. As we discussed in class, push factors away from Detroit led to pull factors into Beardstown, regardless of its racist past. This film shown in class, Moving Flesh, demonstrated the pull factors very nicely, like the affordable and decent housing that was described, as well as in some of the previous chapters. These migrant workers were able to afford very nice homes that were often staggered. It would be a nice Victorian home right next to a mobile home. It just depended on what you could get when. So the affordable and decent housing was a major plus. The safer community life compared to a place like Detroit was definitely a plus. Steady, reliable wages and hours at the plant, and the ability to commute in and out of Beardstown if migrants chose to live in a somewhat safer neighborhood like Rushville. The movie also pointed out some negatives like white supremacy and backbreaking work that Carol and Erin also experienced while working at Cargill.
Although there are various takeaways from Miroth's book, and specifically Chapter 5, one of the biggest takeaways would be the parallel between Detroit and third world urbanization, specifically talking about how third world city problems are very related to the deep-rooted societal issues that Detroit has, specifically the racial injustice and the marginalizations of low-income workers. These issues are very correlated with periphery countries that are struggling to cause social equality and a monetary equality. The second biggest takeaway, I would say, is the impact of the global economic policies on a local scale. So the policies that big companies and corporations, they have an impact on Detroit, specifically their society, and the income of workers is so vastly different that's causing a social inequality as well. And bringing these problems to light can reduce the population decline and the urban blight that's taken place within the city. And these global influences is crucial to formulate a proper policy, practice, and a response. Overall, the biggest takeaway is that there are various issues within the United States that relate to secondary countries and periphery countries, and they need to be addressed now. Thank you.
So, what could future research look like? Researchers that are interested in continuing the work of Miroth's will find that they are spoiled for choice and opportunities to do so. The findings of her work in Beardstown answers a lot of questions that she initially set out to answer, but it also leaves the door open for many more to be asked. While Beardstown may at first appear to be something of an oddball case, Miroth's findings have established that the converging of migrant populations in this town is no coincidence. As we've discussed, labor migration can have a massive demographic shifting effect on populations, turning what was once a sundown town into a diverse hub of foreign and non-foreign laborers. Until research on them crops up, we can only speculate as to the number of other towns who have experienced similar demographic shifts. That is why our first suggestion to those who are interested in continuing this work is to dig around in their own local demographic histories and see what can be found. Cargill is far from the only industrial powerhouse to make a home in rural America, and it is entirely possible that labor migration has even more of an effect than we can currently prove on the demographics of the wider United States. We also suggest that future researchers organize an effort to revisit Beardstown later down the line. Cargill continues to operate and grow, and it is likely that more people will continue to migrate to Beardstown as long as it does. Another study of the demography of the area in around 10 to 20 years could provide some very interesting findings. The same can be said if Cargill were to ever close its doors, an event that will in all likelihoods cause a massive shakeup in the community.